Hello, I'm Nicholas Henschel. I'm the Vicar of St Thomas's here in Groombridge in the High Weald of East Sussex. And this is the fourth of this year's Advent talks. We've sought over these talks to focus on the big themes of the Advent season. Of course, there are many overlapping themes of Advent, above all, that sense of hope and expectation. But particularly in liturgical churches, the focus on the four themes of the patriarchs, those who were the foundational figures of both the Jewish faith and, of course, the Christian faith. The prophets, those who sought to address what was going on in society profoundly, and whose words, particularly in the prophet Isaiah and others, still resonate today down the centuries. And then thirdly, John the Baptist on the third Sunday of Advent. And finally, Mary. The fourth week of Advent is associated profoundly with Mary, the mother of Jesus. The readings and the prayers in most churches will reflect that. And so we're going to explore in this talk this person of Mary. Now, let's note from the outset that, quite unhelpfully, in my humble opinion, later tradition has often obscured the biblical Mary, the Mary we actually know in the New Testament. So many layers of addition have taken place over the centuries, both doctrinally and in popular devotion, that Mary has often become almost a different kind of figure altogether. So let's try and locate Mary very straightforwardly in her biblical context. And remember, just on the side, that there is more in the Quran about Mary than there is in the New Testament. In fact, she's only mentioned relatively rarely in the New Testament, always with real significance. So that's what we want to explore. Sorry. So Mary, what have we got here? Well, let's deal with the name first. We're used to the name Mary in English cultures, certainly. Well, what are the biblical names for Mary? Well, we find two. One is Maria, that's the Greek name for Mary, Maria, that's a very familiar name, but also Mariam, that's used frequently in the New Testament, though you don't normally find that in translations, which is a real shame, because of course the first Christians, and indeed the writers of the New Testament expect us to know this, immediately would recognise something very significant about the name Mariam. Not just Mary, they wouldn't just think Mary. Mariam is the Aramaic form of her name, i.e. the normal one that you'd use in the day-to-day. But Mariam stands out as an extraordinary name because, as I say, those first hearers of the gospel, who of course had all first been Jews, would immediately recognise this name as who? Oh, the sister of Moses. Oh, right, way back in somewhat 1250 BC, Mariam, the sister of Moses. Moses and Mariam working together in all sorts of contexts. A real extraordinarily powerful person. And so already, just in the naming of her as Mariam in the New, we have a resonance. Something very significant is going on. This is a new version of Moses' sister. Oh, well, we'll see. We'll see how that works out. But that's the way the Bible works, through resonance, through depth, through cross-referencing, and so forth. So Mariam is not a mistake. Something very significant is going on here. So what happens to Mary? Well, it's very familiar in its own way in the New Testament. The main accounts of Mary come in the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, and in the Gospel of John, where even though she appears almost not at all, she always appears at very key moments in the journey. So, the person of Mary. We're probably talking about a 16-year-old, something around then. That would be the normal age for getting engaged in the time of Mary and Jesus. So a young woman, a young teenager, to be honest, and she has an extraordinary divine epiphany, which she recognises as the voice of God speaking through the angel Gabriel. Indeed, the angel says at one point, "Look, I am Gabriel, listen to me," as he does to Zechariah in a later passage. And Mary does something extraordinary. So she has this message that she is going to be the mother of the Lord, the mother of the Messiah. Now, she knows what those words mean. She's a devout Hebrew. She is in her Jewish culture, she knows that this is all about something extraordinary, which the Jewish people have been waiting for a very long time. And Mary, is perplexed. No, what on earth is going on? How can this be? How can this be? And then, in a way that I think is utterly extraordinary, Mary says, yeah, let it be to me according to your word. She says an extraordinary yes to God. And if we remember nothing else about Mary, it seems to me that is the most significant, that Mary says yes to God without really knowing what that's going to mean. I mean, let's recognize that's a common biblical theme. If we think of Abraham, Abraham is called by God to go on a massive journey, having no idea where it's going to end, but trusting in God's purposes. Exactly the same with Mary. Mary says yes to God with no idea where this is going to lead, although the signs are quite challenging from the very beginning. And her yes to God, which is of course wonderful and something that we're invited to respond to, is in the terms of her times an extremely potentially costly one, because in the time of Mary, to be unmarried and a parent possibly was a capital offence. I mean, she might have well paid for her life in her culture with that. So this is a very brave young woman, a very brave young teenager who is daring something because she trusts the message that's come to her from God. So that's important about Mary. This is a young woman whose radical openness to the Lord gives her the ability to respond in a way that is breathtaking and glorious. And of course, the outcome of that is she gives birth to Jesus, the Feast of Christmas, which is built around, obviously, that experience. And there are lots of different bits, of course, to the story of Christmas and Mary's role in it. Many of them come from, shall we say, later literature and later tradition. We actually know very little beyond what I've said about Mary. But Mary journeys with Joseph for the birth of their child. I think it's always interestingly resonant in terms of British politics that the reason Mary and Joseph have to go on a journey before their child is born is because of a poll tax. They have to go back to the city where Joseph is registered to pay the poll tax. And we know what happens to poll taxes in our own culture. And also that's a problematic moment, because the Romans are making sure that the people are being counted. Now, this is going to sound odd to us, but one of the things in the Old Testament is King David is told that you mustn't count the people, because somehow that infringes the sovereignty of God. You must never count the people. So actually counting people like the Romans are doing in this context is another sign that something's terribly wrong. Something's terribly wrong. So we need to pick up these nuances. Child is born, and then they find themselves refugees. I think this is an extraordinary, powerful theme, that Mary, Joseph and the child find themselves in a foreign land. And of course, there's a huge resonance, because Egypt has been the place where all sorts of toing and froing has happened for the Jewish people since the beginning of the biblical history. So Mary and Joseph going down to Egypt is a heavy thing. This is a place of exile, a place where Jews do not want to be, a place where you're going to be in danger. And so from the very first, be it Mary's pregnancy and the risks she has there, both personally and in the eyes of her culture, be it in terms of a poll tax, be it in terms of being a refugee, the signs at the very beginning of Jesus' birth are enormously powerful. We are encountering a very different kind of Messiah. And of course, that is a theme we find throughout the New Testament. Again and again, people say, you're the Messiah, so you're going to do this, this and this. And Jesus says, well, no, actually, that's not what the Messiah is. Have you not read? He's constantly referring back to other scriptures saying, you've really misunderstood what this is about. And as we see Jesus beginning to grow up and so forth, then we begin to understand that the characteristics of the God we know in Jesus Christ are compassion and love rather than power and might. Sometimes we forget that, both in our liturgies and in the way we talk about God. And Mary is crucial to this. It seems to me, whatever we can suggest about her character, there is this sense of openness to God. And then if we move to the fourth gospel, the one ascribed to St. John, we see some very deep currents. And let me just pick up on two moments in John's gospel where Mary is pivotal, shall we say. And one of those is the very beginning, the first miracle at wedding in Cana, where, if you remember, they're all having a great party and Jesus and his disciples and Mary are there, and the wine runs out. And Mary goes to Jesus and says, "Oh, they've got no wine." Jesus is quite rude, it would seem, back. He says, "Woman, what's that got to do with me?" And we'll come back to the word woman in a moment. And then she simply says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." And then comes the miracle of the water changed into wine. Now, one of the extraordinary things about that first passage, that first encounter with Mary in John's Gospel, is that the language used foreshadows the crucifixion. Throughout that passage, there are references forward to the end of the Gospel and what Jesus is going to do. And that's in the language, in the structure, and in some of the relationship between Mary and Jesus. So if we fast forward to there, of course, what do we get? We get Jesus on the cross. And who is left? Oh, in John's Gospel, pretty much nobody. Got Jesus and John, the beloved disciple. And that beautiful moment where Jesus turns to John and says, "Behold your mother," and then turns to Mary. And what does he say? He says, "Woman." The same word he's used back at the wedding in Cana of Galilee, "Behold your son." Jesus is reconciling his mother, looking after his mother, knowing that he is about to die, except knowing that that death is going to be the fulfillment of all things and the reconciliation of the whole world. So Mary in John's Gospel has a very small role, but a pivotal role at the very beginning of the ministry and the very end of Jesus' ministry, just as he is about to die. It's sometimes quite difficult to draw out the significance of some of those themes. I simply lay them out there as a fascinating part of the tapestry that is the presence of Mary in the New Testament. What are we to make of all that ourselves? I think what's important is to find a way of reimagining Mary, a gentle Mary, all the meek and mild stuff, the stuff we get in carols, really quite saccharine. Much Christian art about Mary is in the same way very saccharine, casts her as somebody with very little agency, very little sense of her possibilities, just a sort of cipher almost at times, who happens to have given birth to the Saviour of the world. But I don't think that's right. I think that's the opposite of the Mary we meet in the Bible. The Mary we meet in the Bible is a person of great strength, not just of faith, but profound resolve. We see that, yes, as I've said already, in the encounter with Gabriel, telling her that she's going to give birth to the Messiah, but also other moments. I think one of the most beautiful moments in the New Testament, again, only found in Luke's Gospel in this context, is when they go up to the temple to have him circumcised to give thanks the thanks offering for purification. Circumcision's eighth day, I know. So 40 days after his birth, like any normal Jewish child, he is taken up to the temple for the cleansing of Mary and to mark the 40th day. And they had this extraordinary encounter. There's Mary and Joseph with their little tiny baby. And who do they meet? They meet two people, Anna and Simeon. And who are these people? Well, Anna is clearly very old. The writer of Luke goes out of his way to tell us just how old she is and how long she's lived as a widow. And she spends her entire life in the temple, speaking to people about the Messiah, saying her prayers, being a prophetess. And remember, the word prophet means somebody who comments on things, a commentator rather than somebody who sees the future. And then this other person, Simeon, who we don't know how old he is. He's normally imagined as an old man. Doesn't say that. I rather like the idea he might not be an old man, but somebody of a rather different age. And he's been waiting all his life to see the Lord's anointed. And he takes Jesus in his arms and says, Lord, now let your servant go in peace. Your word has been fulfilled. This has been his life's work, waiting for Jesus. That's interesting in its own right, fascinating and very challenging. And then he turns to Mary and says, this one is destined for the rising and falling of many in Israel, and a sword will pierce your own heart too. How does a new mother respond to that? A new mother with her 40-day-old baby. A sword will pierce your own heart too. Mary's up for that. It seems to me that in those early birth stories, we are seeing Mary being prepared for an extraordinary destiny, which isn't all the wild stuff with bizarre statues and certain very strange doctrines about who Mary is. No, not that at all, but an extraordinary invitation to recognise her courage, her agency, and her power to act. She knows the journey ahead is going to throw everything it has at her, that she's going to grieve, that she's going to be in all sorts of contexts where she's tempted to think, what was this all about? And yet, at the end of the journey, she's one of just two people left standing by the cross. You may know the extraordinary piece of music by Pergolesi, the Stabat Mater, incredibly beautiful and deeply moving, which imagines what it was like for Mary standing at the foot of the cross, watching her son die. And yet, Mary becomes foundational to the future, not just because she's the mother of the Lord, but because she is such an extraordinary example of faith in action. She does not despair. She does not give up, be that in the context of being unmarried and giving birth, or be that having to go to Egypt with a man she barely knows, be that living as a refugee. Mary never gives up and never gives in. Her resilience is astonishing, even to the very bitter end, because she has the fundamental confidence, assurance, shall we say, that we're invited to share, that the end is not the end, that this is actually all about glory, right from birth, right to that horrible death. This is all an invitation to put our lives in God's hands, to know him as our Lord and Master, and to follow in his footsteps.